The horse collapsed 3 miles from the water, and Alberta Boone walked the rest of the way with cracked lips and a loaded rifle she could barely lift. That was the truth of how she arrived at Sallow Creek in the summer of 1878, and it was a truth she carried in her body for years afterward, in the ache of her feet, in the memory of heat that had pressed down on her like a physical hand, in the particular way she had learned to ration her own breath in the open desert of the Arizona Territory. She had not cried out there. She had not had the moisture to spare for it. She had simply put one boot in front of the other, dragging herself across pale caliche and cracked earth, past the bleached bones of cattle that had not made it through earlier seasons, with the sun hammering her hat brim flat, and the silence of the desert so complete she could hear her own heartbeat like a warning drum. The horse's name had been Caesar, and she had owned him for 4 years. He was a bay gelding of unsteady temperament and extraordinary endurance, and she had pushed him past what either of them should have survived. When his legs buckled and he went down, she had knelt beside him in the dust and pressed her forehead against his neck and whispered something to him that no one else ever needed to hear. Then she had taken her canteen, her rifle, her saddlebag with its few desperate contents, and she had left him there because she had no other choice, and leaving him was one of the hardest things she had ever done. She was 26 years old. She had been traveling alone for 9 days. The reason for the journey was not a simple one, and Alberta Boone had never been a woman who dealt in simple explanations. She had grown up in Tucson, the daughter of a hardware merchant named Douglas Boone, who had died of a chest infection 2 winters prior, and a mother named Lenora who had died before Alberta was old enough to properly remember her face. What Alberta knew of her mother came from a small oval portrait that she kept in the saddlebag, alongside a leather-bound journal, and a deed to 40 acres of land in the Sallow Creek Valley, which had been her father's final gift to her, and the reason she was crossing the desert alone in the killing heat of an Arizona summer. The deed was real. Her father had acquired the land through a business arrangement with a man named Harlan Voss, and when Douglas Boone died, the land had passed to Alberta by the terms of his will. The difficulty was that Harlan Voss did not believe a woman ought to own land in the Sallow Creek Valley, and he had made his feelings known through a series of increasingly aggressive correspondences, through the intimidation of the attorney in Tucson who had first advised Alberta of her inheritance, and finally through the arrival of 2 men at the small house on Mesquite Street who had told her, very politely, that her continued pursuit of the deed was not in her interest. Alberta had packed that same night. She was not a reckless woman. She was, in fact, a deeply practical one, shaped by years of managing her father's ledgers and navigating the particular kind of world that existed for a woman alone in a territorial town. She knew that the direct route to Sallow Creek meant crossing the Sonoran Desert in the hottest part of the year, and she had prepared as well as any person could, filling every vessel she owned with water, wrapping her skin against the sun, choosing the coolest hours for riding. But preparation and outcome are not the same thing, and the desert had its own mathematics, and Caesar had given everything he had. So she walked. The water, when she finally smelled it, was almost hallucinatory. The scent of moisture in dry air hits the body differently than any other sensation, cutting straight through the fog of heat exhaustion with a kind of primal urgency that has nothing to do with thought. Alberta registered it with her whole chest, and she moved toward it with her last real reserves of will, and when she came over the lip of the shallow ravine and saw the creek below narrow and brown and absolutely beautiful, she almost sat down right there in the dirt and wept. She did not weep. She was Alberta Boone, and she had not wept in the desert, so she was not going to weep at the sight of salvation. She picked her way down the crumbling bank with careful, exhausted feet, and she was watching the ground so closely for loose rock that she did not immediately see the man standing at the water's edge downstream from her. He saw her. Joseph Thatcher was 31 years old, and he had been a rancher in the Sallow Creek Valley for 6 of those years. He was not a large man in the way that sometimes passes for impressive in frontier towns. He was lean and sun-darkened, with the kind of quietness about him that comes from spending most of your time alone with animals and open sky. He had ridden out that morning to check the fence line along his eastern pasture, and he had stopped at the creek to let his horse drink, and he had been standing there thinking about nothing in particular when he saw something move on the far bank of the ravine. He had been watching for 2 full minutes before he was certain it was a person. The figure that came down the bank was a woman in a dust-white shirt and a hat that had lost its shape entirely, moving with the careful, deliberate steps of someone who was operating on the last small engine of themselves. She carried a rifle in one hand and a battered leather saddlebag over her opposite shoulder, and her boots were wrong for the terrain city boots, he registered, with low heels and thin soles, and she was making it anyway with a focus that was almost frightening in its intensity. He did not call out. He watched her reach the water's edge, watched her go to her knees in the soft mud without any apparent concern for her clothing, watched her push her hat back and lower her face toward the surface of the creek. "Slow," he said, and his voice came out quiet but carried in the still air. "Drink slow. You take it fast, your body will fight you." She stopped. She was already halfway to the water, and she stopped, and for a moment she did not move at all. Then she turned her head and looked at him with brown eyes so dry they seemed to have dust in them, and she assessed him with an expression that was simultaneously exhausted and completely alert, and he recognized that expression because he had seen it in cornered animals and in soldiers who had come home from the war, and it was the expression of someone who had been alone with danger for so long that safety itself had become suspicious. He did not move. He held very still, the way you hold still around something wild. "I know how to drink," she said. Her voice was a ruin, cracked and low from dehydration, but the words came out even. "I know you do," he said. "I'm just saying." She looked at him for another moment. Then she cupped water in her hands and drank in small, careful sips, and he watched her shoulders descend from their tense height, and the creek ran brown and silver around her fingers, and the desert went on behind her in every direction, vast and merciless and completely indifferent to what she had just survived. After she had drunk enough to take the worst edge off, she sat back on her heels and looked at him properly for the first time, and he was still standing where he had been, holding his horse's reins with one hand and doing absolutely nothing threatening. "You made it," he said. It was a plain thing to say. But something in the way he said it, with a quietness that held more than the words themselves, as though he understood the full weight of what that statement contained, made her throat tighten in a way that had nothing to do with dehydration. He did not mean merely that she had reached the water. He meant that she was still standing. He meant the 9 days and the heat and the decision to leave Tucson in the night with everything uncertain ahead of her. He meant all of it, though he could not possibly have known all of it, and yet the words carried it anyway, and Alberta Boone, who had not cried in the desert, felt the pressure of tears for the first time since her horse had gone down. She did not cry, but it was close. "My horse is back there," she said. "About 3 miles, he went down. Is he dead? I don't know." The uncertainty of it cost her something visible. "He was breathing when I left." Joseph Thatcher looked at her for a moment. Then he looked back in the direction she had come from, and his jaw moved in the way of a man calculating distances and temperatures and the particular cruelty of the afternoon sun. "Drink a little more," he said. "Then I'll go back for him." Alberta stared at him. "You don't know me." "No," he agreed. "But your horse didn't cross the desert on his own." She did not have a response for that. She turned back to the water, and he went to his saddlebag and found the cloth-wrapped parcel of food he had packed that morning: dried beef, hard biscuit, a small tin of peaches, and he set it on the bank beside her without comment, and she ate in the careful increments of someone who knew her own limits, and neither of them spoke for a while, and the creek moved around them in its brown, unhurried way. His name was Joseph Thatcher. He told her that much before he rode back into the desert, and she told him hers, and he repeated it once: Alberta Boone. the way some people repeat a name to keep it, and then he rode east along the ravine into the heat shimmer and the silence. She sat by the water and waited, and the waiting was its own kind of hard because she was not built for sitting still when there was something unresolved. She refilled her canteen. She turned the pages of the leather journal her father had kept, not reading it exactly, but feeling the weight of the pages under her fingers. She cleaned the dust from her rifle with the corner of her shirt. She watched the far bank of the ravine for Joseph Thatcher's return, and she caught herself watching more than the situation required, and she made herself look at the water instead. He came back an hour later leading Caesar on a rope. The horse was not well, his steps were uncertain and his coat was dark with dried sweat, but he was upright and moving, and when Alberta scrambled up the bank and went to him with both hands outstretched, Caesar dropped his head into her chest with an exhausted trust that made Joseph look away because it seemed like something private. "He needs water and shade," Joseph said from a respectful distance. "There's a barn at my place half a mile south. I can put both of you up for the night if you'll accept it." Alberta had her face pressed against Caesar's jaw and she was doing something that was not quite crying, and she stayed there for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and then she straightened and pulled herself back together and looked at Joseph Thatcher with those dry, dark eyes. "I'm going to Sallow Creek," she said. "I have business there." "Sallow Creek is 6 miles west," he said. "You and this horse need a night's rest before either of you goes 6 more miles." It was practical. It was completely logical. It was also the kind of offer that a woman traveling alone in the Arizona Territory in 1878 had to weigh very carefully, because the world was full of men who extended help with one hand and collected the debt with the other, and Alberta had not survived 9 days alone in the desert by being naive about the nature of hospitality. She looked at him again. He was meeting her eyes steadily, without the particular quality of calculation she had learned to recognize and distrust. His hands were loose at his sides. His horse stood patient at his shoulder. The afternoon sun was beginning its slow decline toward the western mountains, and the temperature was already dropping by fractions, and Caesar's legs were trembling with a fine ongoing shudder that decided it for her. "One night," she said. "One night," he agreed, and he said it without any satisfaction, just a simple confirmation, and she followed him south through the ravine and out onto a flat stretch of pale grass that opened gradually into the valley. The ranch was modest by any honest standard, a low adobe house with a covered porch, a proper barn painted red in a way that seemed almost defiant in the bleached landscape, 2 corrals with cedar posts, a kitchen garden that someone tended with genuine care, and a windmill that turned slowly in the evening breeze. It did not look like a prosperous operation, but it looked like a real one, which is a different and more important thing. There was no one else there. "You live alone?" Alberta asked, because it was the thing a sensible person asked. "Since my brother went to California 2 years ago," Joseph said, and there was no self-pity in it, just a plain fact about the shape of his life. He helped her settle Caesar in the barn, showing her where the feed was stored without being proprietary about it, letting her do the work of caring for her own horse while he took care of his own. The barn smelled of hay and horse and sun-warmed wood, and it was cool enough after the desert that Alberta felt her whole body exhale in relief. He cooked supper on the iron stove, beans and salt pork and cornbread that came out of the oven, golden-edged and serious, and she sat at his kitchen table and ate with an appetite that embarrassed her slightly and he did not comment on, and the oil lamp between them cast a warm, unsteady light, and outside the desert cooled into its nighttime character, which was a different thing entirely from its daytime cruelty. "What's your business in Sallow Creek?" he asked, when the meal was done. She considered him across the table. She had been considering him since the creek, assembling the pieces of him the way she assembled most things, methodically, without rushing to conclusions. He was not a man who took up more room than he needed. His questions were direct without being intrusive. He had ridden 3 miles into the desert afternoon heat to retrieve a horse belonging to a woman he had met 20 minutes earlier, and he had done it without drama or expectation. "Land," she said. "My father left me 40 acres in the valley. I have the deed. A man named Harlan Voss believes the land should be his instead." The change in Joseph Thatcher's expression was small but definite. It was not surprise exactly. It was a kind of grim recognition, like hearing a familiar piece of bad news in a new configuration. "I know Harlan Voss," he said. "I suspected you might," she said. "I suspect everyone in the valley knows Harlan Voss. He has about 400 acres," Joseph said carefully. "He's been adding to them for 3 years, not always through means that would hold up to a careful reading. He sent men to my house in Tucson," Alberta said, "to persuade me to abandon the deed." Joseph was quiet for a moment. His hand was flat on the table, and a small muscle moved in his jaw, and then he was simply looking at her with an expression of such direct, uncomplicated anger on her behalf that it caught her slightly off guard. "He had no right to do that," he said. "No," she agreed. "He did not." They looked at each other across the lamp, and something passed between them that was too early to name but too real to ignore. A recognition of a kind of alignment in the way they saw the shape of things. And Alberta Boone, who was not prone to fanciful thoughts, felt it like a compass needle finding north. She slept in the small spare room off the kitchen, on a narrow bed with a quilt that smelled faintly of cedar, and she slept deeply and without dreaming. And when she woke in the gray early morning, she could hear Joseph already moving in the kitchen, the sound of the iron stove being opened and wood being placed, and the small domestic percussion of a man beginning his day. She lay still for a moment and listened to it, and it was the most comforted she had felt in a very long time. Over the following days, because one night became 2, and 2 became 4, because Caesar needed real rest and Alberta found herself unwilling to rush in the direction of Harlan Voss without thinking it through, she and Joseph Thatcher moved around each other in the careful choreography of 2 people who are curious about each other but come from different schools of caution. She helped where she could, because she was not a woman who sat idle. She learned quickly that Joseph ran about 200 head of cattle, that he had one hired hand named Domingo who came 3 days a week, that he grew his own vegetables with a dedication that was almost philosophical, and that he had a small collection of books on the shelf beside the kitchen window that included a battered copy of Tennyson, a surveying manual, and an almanac from 1874 that he kept for reasons he had not yet explained. On the second morning she found him on the porch before sunrise with a cup of coffee, reading the Tennyson in the gray light, and she sat down in the other chair without asking and he handed her the coffee without being asked, and they watched the sun come up over the eastern ridge in what became their first shared silence that was entirely comfortable. "You read poetry," she said eventually. "My mother sent it," he said. "She's in St. Louis. She sends things." He turned a page. "I read it because I don't want to be the kind of man who doesn't read things." Alberta laughed. It was the first time she had laughed in a while, and it surprised her with its own sound, a real laugh, unself-conscious and clean. Joseph looked at her sideways over the book with an expression that was pleased and slightly dazzled, and then he looked back at the page, and the sun came up over the ridge and turned everything the color of old brass. She told him about her father on the 3rd day. They were mending fence line together along the eastern pasture. She had volunteered, because she was competent with a hammer, and she did not believe in being a guest who contributed nothing. And the work had the good quality of physical labor that allows for honest conversation, where the hands are occupied so the mouth can be truthful. Douglas Boone had been a particular kind of man, practical, quietly loving, not expressive in ways that would have been recognized as such by people who defined love through its demonstrations rather than its consistency. He had taught Alberta to keep ledgers at age 9. He had read to her from the almanac every winter evening of her childhood, discussing crop yields and weather patterns the way other fathers discussed fairy stories. He had not, in 30 years of trying, managed to understand women's fashion, and he had once attended a church social in a shirt that was unmistakably inside out. And when Alberta had whispered this to him, he had looked down and shrugged, and said the evening was too good to waste on going home to change. She had been missing him every day since December, and the deed to the land in Sallow Creek Valley was both her inheritance and the closest thing she had to a conversation she was still having with him. Joseph listened to all of it, driving posts into the hard earth with a steady rhythm, and when she was done he said, "He sounds like a man worth being the daughter of." Alberta looked at the ground for a moment. "He was," she said. They worked in silence for a while. A hawk turned slow circles above the pasture. The cedars along the fence line moved in the light wind. "What happened to your wife?" Alberta asked, because she had been wondering since she arrived, and it was better to ask plainly than to wonder obliquely. Joseph set down the hammer with care. "I was never married," he said. "There was a woman in Prescott 3 years ago. We spoke about it. She decided Arizona was not where she wanted to spend her life, and she went back to Ohio, and that was reasonable of her." He picked up the hammer again. "I was disappointed for a while. Then I was just alone, which is a different thing." "Are you still disappointed?" Alberta asked. He looked at her over the fence line with the directness that she was coming to understand was simply his nature, neither forward nor retreating, just honest. "Less than I was," he said, and returned to the post. Alberta felt color come into her face, and she was annoyed with herself for it, and she drove a nail into a cedar rail with more force than was strictly necessary. On the 4th evening, Domingo rode in at sundown with news that made the supper table go quiet. Domingo Reyes was a small, compact man of about 40, with a face that had been working outdoors since his childhood and eyes that missed very little. He had grown up in the valley, had watched it change through 3 decades of American expansion pressing itself over the older patterns of the land, and he brought to everything he said a particular quality of informed resignation that made him one of the most reliable sources of information in the territory. "Voss is talking," Domingo said, accepting the plate Alberta passed to him with a nod of thanks. "In town. Says the Boone land is coming to him by a court arrangement. He's got a judge in Prescott he uses." Alberta set down her fork. "There is no court arrangement. The deed is clear." "Voss does not concern himself with what is clear," Domingo said. "He concerns himself with what he can make true through money and patience." He glanced at Joseph. "He has been asking about whether anyone has seen a woman traveling alone from the east." The table was quiet. "He knows you're coming," Joseph said to Alberta. "He's known since I left Tucson," she said. "Those 2 men he sent, I imagine they rode fast to tell him I hadn't stopped." Joseph was looking at the table with his jaw set in that particular way. "You'll need a lawyer," he said. "In Sallow Creek, there's a man named Cole Purdy who actually knows the law and is not in Voss's pocket. I know him." "I have the deed," Alberta said. "In my saddlebag. It's properly witnessed and registered in Tucson. Voss's man in Prescott can't overturn a recorded deed without a hearing, and at a hearing I can present the document." "Voss will delay," Domingo said. "That is his method. He delays until people run out of money or patience." "I have enough of both," Alberta said, with a flat certainty that made Domingo look at her with something that shifted toward respect. Joseph was still looking at the table, and then he looked up at her, and there was something in his expression that she could not entirely read, but that sat in her chest in a warm, complicated way. "I'll ride to town with you," he said, "when you're ready to go." "You don't have to do that," she said. "I know Purdy, and I know the road." His voice was even. "And I don't like Harlan Voss." "Nobody likes Harlan Voss," Domingo said without looking up from his plate. They rode into Sallow Creek the next morning, side by side in the early cool, with the mountains catching the first light, and the valley spread open around them in its summer gold. Alberta had her saddlebag with the deed folded carefully inside it, and she sat Caesar, who had recovered remarkably with 2 days of rest and good water, with the straight-backed posture of a woman who understood that how you arrived at a place said something about your intentions. Sallow Creek was not a large town by 1878 standards, But it was a genuine one, a main street with a hardware store, a dry goods establishment, a post office in the front room of a private house, 2 saloons, a small hotel, a livery, a barber shop, and the office of Cole Purdy, attorney at law, which occupied a narrow storefront between the larger of the 2 saloons and a saddle maker's shop. The town watched them ride in. That was the nature of small places strangers were noticed, and a woman riding a bay gelding beside Joseph Thatcher was noticed twice over. Cole Purdy turned out to be a thin, red-haired man of about 50, with ink-stained fingers and spectacles he removed and replaced repeatedly in the course of a conversation, as though the act of thinking clearly required alternate modes of vision. He was, as Joseph had promised, not in Harlan Voss's pocket, a fact he made plain within the first 3 minutes of meeting Alberta. "I have declined 3 separate offers of business from Harlan Voss," he said, spreading her deed on his desk and bending over it with the focused intensity of a man who genuinely loves documents, "because Harlan Voss practices a kind of law that I find aesthetically offensive. This deed," he continued, still reading, "is correct. It is registered. The Tucson filing is dated. The witnesses are named. There is nothing here that Voss can overturn without fabricating evidence, which is a crime, or finding a judge willing to act against a properly registered document, which is also technically a crime, though crimes of that kind have a longer life expectancy than simpler ones in this territory." "What do I need to do?" Alberta asked. "File a presence notice with the county land office. Today if possible, because Voss moves quickly. I'll write the letter." He was already pulling paper toward him. "And you'll need to be present on the land. That matters. Courts give weight to occupancy." "I intend to be present on it," she said. "I intend to build on it." Purdy looked at her over his spectacles with something that might have been amusement and was definitely respect. "Then we have something to work with." Joseph was standing just behind her left shoulder during all of this, not inserting himself, just present in that steady way of his that she was already learning to rely on more than she wanted to admit. When they came out of Purdy's office onto the main street, he paused beside her in the slanted morning light, and they stood together for a moment watching the street. Harlan Voss came out of the dry goods store across the way. He was a big man, thick through the chest and shoulders, with the kind of well-fed confidence that comes from years of getting what you want. He had a wide-brimmed hat and a vest that cost more than most people in the valley made in a month, and he walked with the careful, measured pace of someone who believes the ground is his by right. He saw Alberta and stopped. The 3 of them stood in the middle of Sallow Creek's main street with the morning going on around them, a wagon passing, a dog trotting purposefully toward nothing, the sound of a hammer from the livery, and the moment had a quality of inevitability, like a scene that had been assembling itself toward this particular shape for weeks. Voss looked at Alberta. He looked at Joseph. His expression was not angry, which would have been easier to manage. It was evaluating, the expression of a man reassessing a situation and adjusting his approach. "Miss Boone," he said. He had a voice like furniture being moved across a wood floor, heavy and designed to displace things. "I had heard you were coming." "Mr. Voss," she said, her voice was entirely level. "I hope the journey was not too difficult." He was not really asking. "The journey was fine," she said. He looked at her for another moment. "I'd be happy to discuss the land matter with you in a civil fashion," he said. "There may have been a misunderstanding about the terms of the original arrangement." "There was no misunderstanding," she said. "The deed is clear. I've filed a presence notice with the county land office this morning. I intend to take possession of the property within the week." A small change in Voss's face, not quite anger but the skin around it. Looked at Joseph again, and this time the look was longer and less friendly. "Thatcher," he said, as though the name were something mildly distasteful. "Voss," Joseph said pleasantly. Voss looked back at Alberta. "The territory can be difficult for a person alone," he said. It was not a threat technically. It was the shape of a threat wearing the clothes of advice. "I'm aware," Alberta said. "I crossed the desert alone last week. I'm familiar with difficulty." Something shifted in Voss's evaluation of her. She watched it happen, a small recalculation, a repositioning. He touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that was technically polite and entirely menacing, and he went on down the street, and Alberta breathed out slowly through her nose. "He's going to make this difficult," she said. "He is," Joseph agreed. "But difficult isn't the same as impossible." She looked at him sideways. "Is that from the Tennyson?" He almost smiled. "No, that's just something I've noticed." They ate at the hotel before riding back, at a table in the dining room that had a view of the street, and the conversation had the quality of their early morning porch silences, easy in its movement, genuine in its interest. Joseph told her about the valley, its seasons and its water, and the particular challenge of running cattle in a climate that spent half the year trying to kill everything. She told him about keeping her father's accounts, about the way the business had changed after Douglas Boone got sick, about the months of managing the store alone while he declined. "You've been managing things alone for a long time," he said, not with pity, just observing it the way you observe a landscape. "Since I was about 17, she said. "There wasn't anyone else to do it." "That's a long time," he said. "It taught me things," she said. "I can see that," he said, and the way he said it was a kind of tribute, and she felt it as one. The ride back to the ranch was longer because they went by the eastern road to avoid Voss's main property, which Joseph knew by instinct as the sensible choice, and the longer road went through a stand of cottonwood along the creek where the shade was deep and cool, and the sound of the water was close. They rode slowly here because there was no reason to hurry, and the afternoon had gone soft and golden, and Alberta was aware of how close they were riding, not improperly close, but close enough that she could hear his breathing, close enough that when Caesar stepped sideways toward Joseph's horse she did not correct it immediately. "I want to thank you," she said when the cottonwoods opened back onto the grassland. "For what specifically?" he asked. "For the water," she said. "For going back for Caesar. For Purdy, for riding in with me." He was quiet for a moment and the horses walked on. "You'd have found Purdy yourself," he said. "You'd have done all of it yourself. You've been doing everything yourself." "Maybe," she said, "but it was different having someone there." He looked at her and the afternoon light was on the side of his face, and he was simply looking at her with those direct, quiet eyes, and she looked back, and the distance between them felt both very small and very significant. "Yes," he said, "it was." They did not say anything else about it then, but the thing that had been assembling itself between them since the creek continued its patient assembly, and both of them were aware of it, and neither of them was ready yet to put a name to it, and that was all right. The following week was full. Alberta rode out to her 40 acres with Joseph and Domingo on a Thursday morning and stood on the land her father had chosen and looked at the valley and felt something settle in her that had been unsettled since December. The land was good land. The creek ran along its south edge. The soil was deep. There was natural shelter from a long limestone ridge along the north side. It had not been built on. It was waiting. She stood in the middle of it with the wind moving through the grass, and she thought about Douglas Boone and his almanacs, and the particular way he had of seeing potential in things that other people dismissed, and she understood why he had wanted this land, and she knew what she was going to do with it. "I'm going to build a house," she said, "on the ridge side for the shade, and I want to farm it, not cattle but crops, corn and wheat. The creek water will do it." Joseph was standing beside her, and he was looking at the land the way a person looks at something they have also been thinking about. "The soil will hold wheat," he said. "I've been watching this parcel for years. I always thought it was wasted under Voss's claim." She looked at him. "You knew about my father's land." "I knew it existed," he said. "Voss has been claiming it by occupancy for 2 years, but he's never built on it, never farmed it, just parked some cattle on the creek access to establish use. Your deed is cleaner than anything he can produce." He paused. "I may have told Purdy as much last year as a general legal observation." She stared at him. "You told Purdy about this land last year." He looked mildly uncomfortable, which on him was a small thing, a slight shift of his weight. "I told him that I thought the claim was questionable," he said. "I didn't know about you then. I just thought Voss was doing what Voss does. And then I walked out of the desert," she said. "And then you walked out of the desert," he agreed. They looked at each other, and the improbability of the whole sequence arranged itself between them. Her father's deed and Voss's aggression, and 9 days of desert riding, and Caesar going down 3 miles from the water and Joseph standing at Sallow Creek at the exact moment. She needed someone to be there. And the sheer accumulated coincidence of it was either meaningless or the opposite of meaningless, and they both felt it. "I don't believe in fate," Alberta said, because she was a practical woman who believed in causes and effects. "I don't either," Joseph said, "but I believe in paying attention to what's in front of you." He said it looking at her, and she held his gaze, and her heart was doing something unhelpful, and she turned back to the land because there was a great deal to plan. The legal matter with Voss moved through its own painful bureaucratic timeline. Purdy filed documents. Voss's attorney in Prescott responded with counterfilings. There were 2 hearings, neither of which resolved anything definitively, and between the hearings Voss attempted 2 separate acts of what Purdy called land pressure. Once moving a group of his cattle onto Alberta's parcel in a way designed to reassert occupancy, and once having a foreman approach Alberta in town to renew the offer to purchase the deed at a price designed to insult. Alberta declined the price, sent the cattle off her land personally, and wrote a letter to the county recorder that Purdy called the most efficient piece of legal communication I have encountered from a non-attorney in 20 years of practice. She had grown up keeping her father's accounts and managing his correspondence, and she had a gift for precision that turned out to be extremely useful in territorial law. Voss escalated. There came a morning when Alberta rode out to the parcel and found that the fence line she and Joseph had spent an afternoon building had been cut, not broken, which would have been nature's work, but cut cleanly with wire cutters, which was someone's deliberate message. She stood looking at the cut wire with the morning around her, and something cold moved through her that was not fear but was adjacent to it. This was the kind of thing that escalated, and she knew it, and she thought of Tucson and the 2 men at the door on Mesquite Street, and she thought about Douglas Boone and what he would have done. He would have repaired the fence. She was halfway through replacing the cut section when Joseph arrived. She had not sent for him. He had simply ridden by to check on the parcel, as he had taken to doing in recent days, and he came through the scrub cedar and stopped and looked at the wire on the ground and then at her, kneeling in the dirt with pliers, and his expression was composed but his eyes were not. "When did this happen?" he asked. "Last night, I'd guess. The cuts are clean." He dismounted and came to kneel beside her and took up the other end of the wire, and they worked in silence, side by side in the early warmth, and their hands were sometimes close together, and once his hand covered hers briefly to hold the wire still while she worked the pliers, and neither of them remarked on it, and the contact lasted only a second, but she felt it for considerably longer. "I'm going to speak to Voss," he said, when the fence was done. "Joseph." She sat back and looked at him directly. "I do not want a man interceding on my behalf with Voss. I've been handling Voss. I'm still handling Voss." "I know you are," he said. "I'm not suggesting you can't. I'm suggesting I have something I want to say to him personally that has nothing to do with your business." She studied him. "What do you want to say to him?" He considered how to phrase it. "That he cut a fence on land that borders my property," he said carefully, "which makes it my business as well." "Is that the real reason?" she asked. He met her eyes. "No," he said after a moment. "The real reason is that I don't like the way he's coming at you, and I understand that I don't have a right to act on that, but I am asking your permission to say something to him that is within the bounds of what a neighbor would say." The honesty of it settled in her chest. It was the honest answer without pretense, and she appreciated it more than she could comfortably say right then. "All right," she said. "As a neighbor," he nodded. He spoke to Voss the following day in the main street of Sallow Creek, and whatever he said, and he did not report it to Alberta in full, had the effect that civil directness sometimes has with men who are used to operating in the dark. Voss did not cut any more fences. He did not send anyone to the parcel again. He continued to fight through legal channels, which was legitimate, and his attorney continued to file papers, which was also legitimate, and the situation settled into the kind of grinding legal procedure that was at least preferable to men in the night with wire cutters. It was in this period, the weeks of legal waiting, of daily life at the ranch while Alberta's house was being slowly built on her land with help from Joseph and Domingo, and two other men from the valley, of evenings on the porch and early mornings with coffee and the Tennyson, that what was between Alberta Boone and Joseph Thatcher began to take its real shape. It was not dramatic, the way love stories are sometimes told to be, full of grand gestures and impassioned declarations. It was the other kind, which is in some ways the more powerful kind, the kind that builds itself out of small true things, accumulating like sediment, until you look up one day and find that something substantial has been created without your having planned it. She knew he woke at 4 every morning and was always quiet until after his first coffee, not from moodiness, but from the same kind of internal organization that required her to balance every column before she could consider the day open. She knew he had a particular expression he used when he was annoyed that was almost completely invisible to people who did not know how to look for it, a very slight flattening around the eyes, a stillness that was slightly too still. She knew he had been reading the Tennyson for 6 years and was on his third pass through it, and that he had sections memorized without having intended to, because he was the kind of person who absorbs what he loves. He knew she counted things under her breath when she was anxious, not visibly, but he had learned to watch her lips and see the small private arithmetic she ran to reassure herself. He knew she was most herself in the early morning, before the full demands of the day had assembled themselves, and that she grew quieter rather than louder under stress, which was the opposite of most people he knew. He knew that she missed her father with a grief that was still unresolved and running underground, the way water runs underground in the desert, invisible at the surface but entirely present, shaping everything. One evening in the 6th week, August now, the heat at its highest and the evenings blissfully cool, they were sitting on the porch after supper, and the stars were the enormous undiluted stars of the Arizona night that exist nowhere else in quite that quantity or clarity, and Alberta had the journal open in her lap but was not reading it, and Joseph was doing nothing at all, which he was better at than most people. "My father wrote about this valley," she said, "in the journal. He came out here in 1869. He described the creek and the ridge and the quality of the soil." She ran her fingers across the page. "He said it was the kind of place where a person could build a whole life and have it be enough." Joseph said nothing. He was listening in the particular way he listened, which was complete and unhurried. "I used to think that was a modest ambition," Alberta said, "to build a life and have it be enough. I thought a person should want more than enough." She looked out at the dark valley. "I think I was wrong about that. I think enough, when it is the right enough, is actually the most you could ask for." "What would the right enough look like?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. The stars turned their slow, enormous turning. "The land," she said, "the house, work that matters. People that are real." She paused and then added quietly, "Someone to watch the sunrise with." The porch was quiet. "Alberta," he said. She turned to look at him, and he was already looking at her, and his eyes in the starlight were the dark, honest eyes she had first seen at Sallow Creek when she was barely standing upright, and the distance between them was exactly the distance it had been all these weeks, maintained out of care, out of not wanting to complicate what was already complicated, out of respect for each other's particular kinds of self-sufficiency, and it felt, suddenly, like a waste. "I would like to be that person," he said simply, "if you would permit it." She looked at him. She looked at him for a long time, because she was a woman who believed in being certain about important things. "I think you already are," she said. He reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand, and she let him, and they sat together in the Arizona night with the stars above them and the valley below and the creek running somewhere in the dark. And it was not the beginning of something so much as the acknowledgement of something that had been true for weeks. He did not kiss her that night. He held her hand, and when she went inside he held onto it just long enough to make the moment real, and then let her go with a look that contained a great deal more than could have been said. And she went inside and stood in the small room with the cedar-scented quilt and pressed her hands to her face and felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight since December, since Tucson, since the desert, since Caesar going down and the long, terrible last 3 miles on foot. Something she had been carrying so long she had ceased to register it as weight. The next morning they watched the sunrise together from the porch, and the day was entirely normal and entirely new, and it was both of those things at once. The legal resolution came in September, and it came in a way that Purdy described as brisk, which is unusual, and a reflection of the quality of the documentation. The Prescott hearing went strongly in Alberta's favor. Her deed was registered and dated. The witnesses were contactable, and Voss's attorney could produce nothing cleaner than a claim of occupancy that was demonstrably thinner than Alberta's legal right. The judge, who was not the Prescott judge Voss habitually used because that particular judge had been asked to recuse himself on grounds of a prior business relationship with Voss that someone had taken the trouble to document for the territorial court, ruled for Alberta. She received the news in Purdy's office on a Tuesday morning in mid-September, with Joseph beside her and Purdy beaming through his spectacles, and the official recognition of what was already true felt extraordinary anyway, the way the formalization of important things always does. She walked out of Purdy's office onto the main street of Sallow Creek, and the sun was full on her face, and Joseph was beside her, and she stood still for a moment just receiving it. "Your father bought good land," Joseph said. "He bought very good land," she said. She turned to look at him, and they were standing in the street just as they had stood 6 weeks earlier when Voss had come out of the dry goods store, but everything was different now because it was resolved, and she was still standing, and he was still there. "I need to write to Purdy's witness fee," she said, "and I need to write to the county recorder, and I should go to the land and walk it now that it's properly mine." "Yes," he said, and after that, she looked up at him, and the morning was warm and clear and full of the ordinary sounds of a working town, and she felt in this moment the very particular quality of happiness that belongs to people who have worked for what they have and know exactly what it cost. "After that," she said, "I'd like to have supper with you and tell you something." He raised his eyebrows slightly, in that economical way of his. "Something good," she said, and the corner of her mouth moved upward. "Then I'll look forward to it," he said. She walked the 40 acres that afternoon in the long gold light, and the house was half built on the ridge stone and adobe, with a covered porch facing the valley, which she had insisted on because she had decided she was a person who wanted covered porches in her life. The frame of it stood against the sky, and the creek ran along the south edge, and the soil was everything Purdy had confirmed it to be, and she stood in the middle of the future and felt it solid under her feet. Douglas Boone had been right. This was the kind of place where you could build a whole life and have it be enough, the right enough. At supper, with the oil lamp between them and the beans on the table and the bread Joseph had made that afternoon because he had apparently developed a bread-making habit that she found disproportionately endearing, she set down her fork and looked at him directly. "I would like to stay in the valley," she said. "I'd like you to stay in the valley," he said. "I would like to build the house and farm the land. I intend to ask Purdy about the proper legal process for establishing a farm operation because I want to do it correctly." "That sounds like you," he said. "And," she said, "I would like to continue watching the sunrise with you, on a permanent basis. If that is a thing you would want." Joseph Thatcher set down his own fork and looked at her across the lamp with an expression that was completely serious and completely warm simultaneously, which was a thing she had learned was just his nature, the seriousness and the warmth existing together, neither one diminishing the other. "Are you proposing to me, Alberta?" he said. "I am telling you what I want," she said. "I have found that telling people directly what you want is more efficient than the alternative." "It is," he agreed. Well, he said, and he smiled then, a real smile, full and unguarded, which was rare enough on him that it hit her like the sunrise had that first morning. "I would like to marry you if you are amenable to being married." "I am amenable," she said. "I would like to negotiate the terms." He laughed. It was a genuine laugh, uncontrolled, and she had heard it a handful of times since the first morning with the Tennyson, and it was one of her favorite sounds in the world. "Of course you would," he said. "All right, what are the terms?" "The land is mine," she said. "The farm is mine, legally and in every practical sense. If we marry, our finances are shared, but the deed to the 40 acres remains in my name." "Agreed," he said without hesitation. "The house I am building is our house, but it is built on my land and I make the decisions about it." "You were already making the decisions about it," he pointed out. "I've just been hammering what you tell me to hammer." "Exactly," she said. "I want that to continue." "It will continue," he said. "Are there more terms?" She looked at him. "The rest are things I'd rather say than negotiate," she said more quietly. He nodded and reached across the table, and she took his hand, and the lamp burned between them warm and steady. "Then say them," he said. "I love you," she said plainly, because she was Alberta Boone and plain was her truest register. "I have been in love with you since the sunrise on the second morning, I think, though I didn't say it to myself in those words until later. You are the most genuinely decent person I have encountered, and I say that having encountered a sufficient number of people to make the comparison meaningful." Joseph was quiet for a long moment, and his hand was warm around hers, and his eyes were doing the thing where the seriousness and the warmth were so combined that you could not separate them. "I loved you when you were walking out of the desert," he said. "I didn't know it yet. But I couldn't stop watching you come down that bank, and when you got to the water I felt something I did not have a name for at the time." He paused. "I have a name for it now." "What is the name?" she asked, because she wanted to hear him say it. "Relief," he said, "which I know sounds strange, but it felt like being relieved of something, like something I had been waiting for had finally arrived." She looked at him for a long time. "That is not a strange way to say it," she said. "That is exactly right." They were married in October, 6 weeks later, in the small Protestant church in Sallow Creek, with Purdy as a witness and Domingo standing at the back of the church wearing his good hat. And the church was full of valley people who had watched Harlan Voss accumulate land for 3 years and were privately pleased to see the tables turn. And the minister was a young man who was so moved by the obviousness of the feeling between the two people in front of him that he got briefly off script in his remarks and had to collect himself. Alberta wore her best dress, which was a deep blue wool that she had worn to her father's memorial service and was repurposing for better use, and she had pinned her hair up in a way that she associated with her mother's portrait, though she could not have explained why. And when Joseph saw her come through the church door, he went very still in the way he went still when something registered deeply. And she saw his expression and carried it with her up the aisle like something precious. They exchanged rings that Joseph had made in Prescott by a silversmith plain bands, narrow, which was exactly what Alberta had specified when she had written him a list of preferences, because she was that kind of person, and he was the kind of person who was grateful for the list. That evening there was a modest celebration at the ranch, a proper supper cooked by Domingo's wife, Esperanza, who arrived at noon with a pot of something that smelled like every good thing that had ever happened, and proceeded to take ownership of Joseph's kitchen with cheerful authority. There was music from a fiddle player named Old Franklin, who played everything slightly too fast, but with such enthusiasm that it hardly mattered, and people danced in the yard under the enormous stars. Alberta danced with Joseph twice. The second time was slow, and the music was softer, and he had his arms around her, and she had her face against his shoulder, and the valley was dark around them with the mountains just visible against the star-thick sky. And she thought about the desert and the 9 days and Caesar going down, and the 3 miles on foot and arriving at the water half destroyed, and she thought about Joseph standing there at the creek's edge, and the thing he had said. "You made it," and all that it had meant. She pressed her forehead against his shoulder and felt his arms tighten around her, and the fiddle played its racing sweet music, and the stars turned above the Arizona valley, and she had made it, and it meant everything he had meant when he said it. The winter of 1878 moving into 1879 was a working one, full and purposeful. The house on the ridge was completed in November, stone walls, adobe plaster, a covered porch facing the valley exactly as Alberta had specified, 2 rooms downstairs and 1 upstairs reached by a narrow stair that Joseph had built from cedar with a care that suggested he had been looking for reasons to do fine work. Alberta moved her few possessions in with a combination of practicality and ceremony that made Joseph smile privately, watching her set her father's portrait on the shelf and the leather journal beside it, and stand back to look at both of them with an expression of quiet reckoning. She was farming in the spring. The winter had given her time to plan it properly, to study the soil and the water and the almanac, to correspond with a seed merchant in Tucson who knew her father's name, and sent a particularly helpful letter about wheat varieties suited to valley conditions. Joseph helped her turn the first section of ground. They worked together behind a mule named Cortez who had the disposition of someone performing a public service and wanted acknowledgement of it. And the turned earth smelled black and mineral and alive, and Alberta ran it through her fingers and nodded with the expression of someone who has confirmed what they already knew. Harlan Voss left the valley in the spring of 1879. There was no great drama about his departure. His legal options had been exhausted, and his business model depended on the accumulation of land that other people did not have the resources to defend, and there were other valleys and other territories and other people with less resources. He went, and the valley was different without him, not entirely different, because the territory was still the territory and the injustices that existed were larger than one man, but different in the particular small way that the removal of a specific, localized pressure changes the atmosphere of a place. People breathed slightly differently. Fences went uncut. Alberta noted Voss's departure in her journal with 3 words: "He is gone." Then she turned the page and went back to writing about crop rotations. What she was also writing about, increasingly, in the private language she used in the journal that was not her father's formal prose but something looser and more personal, was life at the ranch and on the farm, and the specific quality of days that were full of work and real, and at the end of which she had someone to sit with on the porch and watch the evening arrive. She wrote about Joseph's hands, which were the hands of someone who worked hard and carefully and whose work showed in everything he touched. The fence posts he set, the bread he made, the cedar stair in their house. She wrote about the way he looked at her in the morning when she was still assembling herself for the day, with that expression of uncomplicated warmth that was not performed because he did not perform things. She wrote about the conversations that could go on for an hour across the supper table, and the silences that could go on for an hour on the porch, and how both of them were a form of the same thing. She wrote, "I did not know that the right enough could feel like abundance. I know it now." In the summer of 1879, she told him she was going to have a child. She told him in the morning, on the porch, with coffee, which was where they told each other most of the important things. She had been fairly certain for 2 weeks, and she had spent those 2 weeks being entirely certain about her own feelings before raising the subject, because she was a woman who believed in knowing what she thought before she said it. Joseph's response was to set down his coffee cup with great care, look at her for a long moment, and say, "Are you well?" "I am very well," she said. He exhaled, a long, slow release, and then he smiled, that full, unguarded smile, and she realized his first question had been concern for her before anything else, which seemed exactly right. "I would like to write to my mother," he said. "She has been asking about grandchildren in every letter for 3 years. I would like the satisfaction of answering the question." Alberta laughed. "Write to your mother." The pregnancy was, in Alberta's view, an experience that combined genuine wonder with significant physical inconvenience, and she managed both with the same methodical approach she applied to everything. She kept working through the summer less physical labor, but the accounts and the correspondence and the planning that kept the farm functioning, seated at the table with the windows open and the breeze coming through. Joseph moved around her with a careful attentiveness that never tipped into fussing, which she appreciated, because fussing would have made her impatient. Domingo's wife Esperanza became a genuine friend in this period, coming to sit with Alberta in the afternoons, and bringing remedies and advice, and the particular warm competence of a woman who had been through this experience multiple times and had strong opinions about all of it. Alberta, who had spent most of her adult life without female companionship of this kind, accepted it with something approaching gratitude. "You are not afraid," Esperanza observed, one afternoon in late summer. "I am afraid of things going wrong," Alberta said honestly, "but I don't find being afraid very useful." "No," Esperanza agreed, "but you can feel it without being defined by it." Alberta considered this. "That might be the wisest thing anyone has said to me in years," she said. Esperanza smiled. "I have a lot of children. I have had time to think." The baby was born in February of 1880, on a cold night with the wind coming down from the mountains in a serious way, and Esperanza was there, and Joseph was there, and the whole thing was difficult and then suddenly not difficult at all because there was a baby, a boy. Joseph Henry Thatcher, named for his father and grandfather, who arrived into the world with a quantity of dark hair and an expression of profound indignation that Esperanza found hilarious and Alberta found entirely relatable. Joseph held the baby for the first time while Alberta was being settled and made comfortable, and she watched him from across the room. This lean, quiet man holding this impossibly small person with his hands so careful, his face doing something she had never seen it do, which was break completely open with a love that had no composure to it at all. And she had to look away because it was too much for the moment, too large, and she needed to be able to breathe. Later, when the room was quieter and the wind had settled and Esperanza had gone home and Domingo had ridden back to his own house, and it was just the three of them in the house on the ridge, the stone walls and the cedar stair and the portrait of Douglas Boone on the shelf, Joseph sat beside her on the bed with the baby between them, and they were both extremely tired and neither of them was sleeping. "Henry," she said, trying the name. "Henry," he agreed. The baby was asleep with his fist against his own cheek, and the lamp was low, and outside the valley was dark and cold and the creek was running. "My father would have liked this," Alberta said. "This place, you, all of it." "I think I would have liked him," Joseph said. "I think so too," she said. She leaned her head against his shoulder and he put his arm around her, and they sat together in the warm, small circle of the lamplight with their sleeping son between them, and the night went on in its quiet way around the house that she had built on the land her father had left her, and it was enough. It was the right enough. In the spring, she planted the second season's wheat. She had learned a great deal from the first season, about the soil's particular drainage patterns, about the timing relative to the creek's spring rise, about which sections of the 40 acres received the most direct water. The second planting was more precise, more confident, and the results showed in the summer. A good stand of wheat, properly headed, enough to satisfy the farm's needs and have surplus to sell, which went straight into the account she kept in her ledger with Douglas Boone's careful handwriting on the cover that she had kept and intended to keep. Henry was learning to stand up that summer, using everything in reach as leveraged table legs, chair rungs, Caesar's patient foreleg when she took the baby out to the barn, which Caesar tolerated with what Alberta interpreted as dignified benevolence. He had a personality that was already recognizable, her focused intensity and Joseph's fundamental stillness in a combination that was entirely its own thing, a small distinct person being himself very completely. Life in the valley settled into the rhythms of genuine permanence. Joseph's cattle operation and Alberta's farm shared the labor and the decisions in the particular way that working partnerships develop, when the two people in them are each competent and each willing to learn from the other's competence. There were disagreements about timing, about resources, about the correct approach to a broken fence post at 11 o'clock at night in a rainstorm, which became a story they told for years. But the disagreements were the productive kind, the kind that moved toward resolution rather than away from it, because both of them were fundamentally more interested in solving the problem than in being right about the problem. Cole Purdy came to dinner in the fall of 1880, bearing legal documents that transferred a small adjacent parcel of land back to its original boundary, a quiet unraveling of one of Voss's earlier acquisitions that Purdy had pursued out of what he called professional satisfaction. Alberta added the parcel to her accounts and wrote Purdy a letter of such precise and genuinely felt appreciation that he read it twice and kept it in his desk drawer. Domingo and Esperanza's family remained central. Their children grew up alongside Henry, and the two families moved through each other's lives in the comfortable way of people who have chosen each other in the absence of blood obligations, which is a kind of choosing that means more than it looks like from the outside. Alberta understood, in this relationship and others in the valley, something about the community that had existed here long before the American expansion. She had arrived as part of the layered history of the land, and the people who had worked it under different flags and different names. And she tried to hold that understanding with the respect it deserved. The years moved. Henry learned to walk and then to run and then to get onto a horse with the natural ease of someone who grew up around horses, which he did. He had his father's eyes and his mother's mouth and both of their stubbornness, which expressed itself differently depending on the time of day. He asked questions constantly, from age 3 onward, and Alberta answered all of them with the same directness she applied to everything, because she believed that children who were given real answers became people who trusted their own thinking. "Why is the desert so big?" he asked one afternoon when he was about 4, sitting on the porch while Alberta was doing accounts. "Because this is a big place," she said without looking up. "Did you really cross it all by yourself?" She looked up at him then. He was looking at her with the specific quality of attention children bring to the things that matter to them. "Yes," she said, "on my horse Caesar." "Caesar is old," Henry said. "He is," she said. "He was younger then, we both were." Henry thought about this. "Were you scared?" "Yes," she said honestly. "But you did it anyway." "I had to," she said. "The land was your grandfather's. I needed to keep it." Henry looked out at the valley with the expression, already familiar, of someone running a calculation. "I'm glad you kept it," he said. "So am I," she said. Joseph came around the corner of the house at that moment, carrying a fence post and walking in his unhurried way, and Henry spotted him and launched himself off the porch with the aerodynamic commitment of small children. And Joseph caught him one-armed without breaking stride and kept walking, Henry on his hip, toward the barn. And Alberta watched them from the porch and felt the thing she felt most days now that she had learned to receive without deflecting: the solid, unambiguous good fortune of her life. In the fall of 1882, she had a second child. A girl this time, with red hair that neither of her parents had, and that caused significant comment in the valley, until Esperanza pointed out that Joseph's brother, who sent letters from California, had red hair, which resolved the mystery. They named her Clara, after no one in particular, because it was a name that suited her. She arrived with a disposition of sunny certainty that never entirely left her. A child who believed from the beginning that the world was fundamentally interesting, and that the correct response to it was engagement. Henry, at 2.5, was circumspect about Clara for approximately 1 week, during which he watched her with scientific detachment from the far side of whatever room she was in. Then he decided she was acceptable and became her most consistent protector, which lasted for the rest of their childhood and beyond. Joseph wrote to his mother in St. Louis with the news of Clara's birth, and the letter he received back was 3 pages long and contained both significant emotion and a package of gifts, including a small crocheted blanket, a new volume of poetry, and a letter written separately to Alberta that made Alberta sit down at the kitchen table and read it twice before pressing it between the pages of her father's journal, where it stayed. Eliza Thatcher had written, "You are the kind of woman I hoped for him, and I say that knowing it is presumptuous to say, because you are clearly a woman who did not require hoping for by anyone. What I mean is that my son is better known by the world because you are in his life, and I am grateful." Alberta wrote back a letter that was, by her standards, remarkably warm. The decade moved forward. The farm expanded wheat and then corn, and then a kitchen garden so productive that Alberta began selling surplus to the hotel in Sallow Creek, which led to a supply arrangement with the dry goods store and a modest but genuine secondary income. The accounting ledgers grew thick and their columns remained balanced, and she trained Henry in keeping them from age 7, just as Douglas Boone had trained her. Joseph's cattle operation grew steadily, and he and Domingo developed a partnership that was formalized in 1883, which made Domingo a part owner of the livestock operation, and changed nothing about how they worked together because they had always worked together as though it were already so. Caesar died in the summer of 1883. He was old, as Henry had accurately observed, and he had been well for his age, and he died on a warm evening in the pasture with the grass under him and the creek visible from where he lay. Alberta was with him. She had been watching for the signs, and she knew when they were close, and she sat in the grass beside him with her hand on his neck, as she had sat in the desert dust when his legs had buckled under him 5 years before, and she spoke to him in the same quiet register that private things are said in, and when he stopped breathing the evening was completely still. Joseph found her there a while later, still sitting in the grass, looking at nothing in particular. He sat down beside her without comment, and she leaned against his shoulder, and they sat together in the pasture as the light went down, and she thought about the desert and the 3 miles and what had come after, and all the particular improbable beauty of the path from there to here. "He was a good horse," she said eventually. "He was an extraordinary horse," Joseph said. "He carried me very far," she said. "He did." The stars were beginning to come out over the eastern ridge. The valley was settling into its nighttime character, and the creek was running somewhere in the dark. "Joseph," she said. "Yes. I am very glad I crossed the desert," she said. He put his arm around her. "So am I," he said. "Every day." She turned her head and looked at him in the last of the evening light, and he was looking back at her the way he always looked at her, with the directness and the warmth and the seriousness all together, that particular quality of seeing someone completely that is rarer than any amount of beauty. And she felt it as she felt it every time, which was like a hand on the compass needle, pointing home. "I love you," she said. "I love you," he said. And it was not the first time they had said it, and it was not remarkable except that it was, every time, because the word does not wear out between people who mean it. Henry turned 10 in 1890, and the valley was different in 1890 than it had been in 1878, changed in both good and difficult ways that the decade had accumulated. The railroad had come through the territory, which changed what was possible and what was necessary, and the price of certain things and the pace of others. The town of Sallow Creek had grown, a new school, which Alberta had lobbied for with the same methodical effectiveness she brought to everything, and which Henry and Clara attended, and which employed a teacher who had come from back east and was initially terrified of the desert, and gradually became a person who could not imagine living anywhere else. Alberta served on the school board. She served as though it were the most natural thing in the world, which she felt it was, and she proceeded to improve things in ways that were hard to argue with because they were so obviously correct. And eventually, the other board members stopped trying to argue and simply adopted whatever she proposed. Joseph served as well on the town council, in the capacity of someone who was respected for his judgment and unwilling to be on the wrong side of things, which made him useful in situations where people needed someone to say directly what ought to be said. He said things directly but without cruelty, which is a rarer combination than it should be. Their life together had the quality that Alberta had once identified as the right enough, and she had been correct that this was the most you could ask for, and she had not anticipated, or had not let herself anticipate, which was perhaps the same thing, how much more it would continue to become. How the right enough kept expanding at its edges, kept finding new corners and new warmths, kept being more than it had been the season before. In the spring of 1892, she sat on the porch on a morning in early April with her coffee, watching the wheat come up in the south field in its precise planted rows. And Henry was in the barn doing his morning chores with the focused competence of a 12-year-old who has been taking farm work seriously for years. And Clara was somewhere she had not yet been asked to account for, which with Clara was standard operating procedure. And Joseph came out with his coffee and sat in his chair beside her. The mountains had lost their winter snow on the lower slopes but kept it at the tops, which was the particular April look of the Arizona high desert that Alberta had come to love the way you love something that is a specific combination of things that exist nowhere else. The cottonwoods along the creek were going green. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I am thinking about my father," she said. "He would have been 62 this year." What would he be doing at 62? She considered. Reading the almanac, she said, making observations about the weather, writing things down. She paused, "Being glad that I am here." Joseph nodded. "I think he always knew I would come," she said. "I think the deed was a way of making sure of it, of making sure I had something here to come to." "He was right to be sure," Joseph said. She looked at the wheat coming up in its rows and the creek beyond it catching the early light and the mountains standing in their old patient way behind everything. "He was," she said. They sat in the comfortable quiet of two people who have been watching mornings together long enough that the silence is its own kind of conversation, and the coffee was good, and the light kept improving, and the valley went about its April business of becoming more itself. Clara came tearing around the corner of the house at a speed that suggested either genuine emergency or significant excitement, which with Clara were difficult to distinguish before she got close enough to read her face. She was 9 years old and red-haired, and she ran the way she did everything else, with complete commitment. "There is a fox in the chicken yard," she announced, arriving at the porch steps. Alberta set down her coffee. "How long has there been a fox in the chicken yard?" She asked with the specific calm of a woman who has managed chicken yard situations before. "Just now," Clara said. "I saw it go in through the broken board." Joseph was already up. "Where's Henry?" "Barn," Alberta said, moving. They dealt with the fox between Joseph coming from the front and Henry coming from the barn side, and Clara, who had appointed herself director of operations and took to this role naturally, coordinating from the fence post, and the fox escaped without casualties to either chickens or fox, and the broken board was repaired by 9 in the morning, and Henry had opinions about the repair technique that he expressed in full and were not wrong. Afterward, standing in the yard with the chicken yard board properly hammered and the morning fully underway, Alberta looked at her family, Joseph brushing sawdust from his shirt, Henry explaining fence construction improvements to a largely theoretical audience, Clara describing the fox's departure trajectory to no one in particular, and she felt the thing that she had carried for a long time and learned to hold openly: gratitude. Not the abstract kind, not the performance kind, but the specific, unambiguous gratitude of someone who has stood at the edge of the desert and walked the last 3 miles alone and arrived at the water barely standing, and found on the other side of that a life that was real and warm and full and entirely, completely worth it. She had crossed the desert alone, and the horse had gone down, and the sun had been relentless, and she had been cracked and empty and uncertain of everything except the next step and the step after that. And she had arrived at the water, and he had been there, and he had said she had made it, and he had meant more than that, and she had. She had made it. And every morning since, in the stone house on the ridge, in the sound of Henry's voice from the barn and Clara's from wherever Clara currently was, in the wheat coming up in its careful rows, in the mountain standing at the edge of the sky, in Joseph's hand in hers on the porch in the evening when the stars came out enormous and unapologetic over the Arizona Valley, she knew what she had made it to. The right enough. The right everything. Years later, when Henry was grown and managing a section of the farm with the particular calm confidence of a man who has always known exactly where he belongs, and Clara was teaching at the Sallow Creek School, in a position she had pursued with the full force of her personality, and one entirely on merit, Alberta wrote in the last pages of the leather journal, Douglas Boone's journal, which had outlived its original author and gone on to hold the continuation of his story as Alberta understood it. She wrote about the creek and the morning she had arrived at it. She wrote about the man at the water's edge and the way he had held still and what he had said. She wrote, "He told me I had made it, and he meant more than the water, and I did not understand all he meant until years later, when I understood that the making of it is not a single moment, but the accumulation of all the moments after. The waking and the working and the planting and the seasons and the conversations at supper time and the silences on the porch and the children's voices and the sound of his breathing in the dark, all of it together. Every ordinary day made particular by who you are living it with." She wrote, "I crossed the desert alone, and I would not change that because the crossing was mine and it made me know what I was. But what I made it to was not the land or the house or the legal resolution or the farm or any single thing. What I made it to was this particular life, with this particular person, in this particular valley that my father chose for reasons he wrote in his almanac in language that was practical and exact and somehow also, if you read it right, a love letter." She closed the journal. Outside, the evening was coming in with the long, slow colors it brought in the fall, and the wheat stood cut and gathered, and the creek ran in its old, unchanging way, and the mountains caught the last of the light on their upper slopes and held it there as long as they could. Joseph came to the door and stood with his shoulder against the frame, the way he had stood on so many evenings in so many of the years they had been building toward this ordinary, extraordinary night. "Are you coming?" he asked. She set the journal on the shelf, beside her father's portrait and the narrow silver band she sometimes left there while she worked and always put back on, and she looked at the room, the stone walls and the cedar stair, and all the accumulated careful evidence of a life lived fully and on purpose, and she went to where he was standing. He put his arm around her, and they went out onto the covered porch that faced the valley, the one she had insisted on, the one she had drawn into her plans on the third morning she was in the valley, and knew she was staying. The stars were beginning to come out above the mountains, the enormous unhurried Arizona stars that exist nowhere else in quite that quantity or that particular quality of light, and the valley was going dark in its evening way, and the creek ran somewhere below them, and it was enough. It was the most you could ask for. It was everything.